Okay. Good morning and welcome to the Carnegie Endowment and welcome to another event on Syria. Of course, the recent weeks have witnessed many developments regarding the Syrian crisis. The chemical attack issue, the Russian-US agreement, the UN report regarding these chemical issues and the ongoing discussions currently at the UN to come up with a resolution on these chemical weapons. In this morning, we would like to examine the regional dynamics regarding the issue, as well as the US policy debate and the future regarding not just the chemical attack issue, but more broadly the Syrian crisis in its entirety. We're very fortunate and very privileged to have with us today a panel of true experts on the different angles and countries regarding this issue. We have with us from Geneva His Excellency Ambassador Nasser al-Qudwa. Ambassador Qudwa, of course, is well known to all of you. He currently is the deputy to UN and Arab League Special Envoy on Syria, Lakhdar Brahimi. He also served as the Palestinian Authority Foreign Minister, 2005-2006, and he also served, of course, for a long time at the UN as the Palestinian ambassador to the UN, and as such, he is really, truly, uniquely placed to inform us about the UN angle, the UN debates, and the UN report regarding chemical weapons. Also joining us from Beirut is Paul Salem. Paul is the director of our center in Beirut, and Paul has been very active in following the Syrian issue from the region for a very long time. In Washington, we have Andrew Weiss, who is the Carnegie Endowment Vice President for Studies, and where he oversees research in Washington and Moscow on Russia and Eurasia, who would handle for us the U.S. policy debate regarding the and the Russian angle as well. And of course, Karim also Sajadpour, our expert on Iran. Karim would also bring us up to date about the Iranian position, particularly in light of the recent developments on Syria. So with that, I would first like to give the floor to Ambassador Qudwa. I will ask each speaker to maybe give us an opening remarks of 5 minutes each in response to questions that I will pose, and then we will open it up to debate. So, Ambassador Qudwa, first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to join us. Everyone's eyes are focused on the UN, both in terms of the chemical attack report that was just released 2 days ago by the UN, and in terms of the ongoing discussions currently now on a UN resolution regarding these chemical attacks. I would like to ask you about this, but also ask you whether there are any other negotiations or discussions at the UN between Russia and the United States, or through the offices, your offices, the offices of Lakhdar Brahimi. Are there any also discussions aimed at restarting a political process that would aim to deal more broadly with the other issues on the table, or are you, for now, limiting the discussions to the chemical weapons issue? So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muallim. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you also for the nice introduction and for the opportunity for me to participate in this important debate on Syria, which I believe represent one of the most dangerous situations that presents serious threat to peace and security. I try to answer the question you raised, but if you bear with me just a minute or two to go back a little bit to try to put things in perspective. Now, as we all know, in Syria, bloodshed, destruction, and human suffering have continued for the last 2.5 years. Nevertheless, the situation has become much more complicated with the increased sectarian nature of the violence, increased presence and influence of the jihadist groups, and increased regional dimension in both ways. And with this, of course, search for political solution also continues. The United States, as much as I understand it, the United States position is one recognizing that there is no military solution. Furthermore, the United States and Russia remain committed to Geneva Communique of June 2012. The communique, with its language, I might say even with its vague language that can accommodate political changes and practical changes on the ground, remains, in my mind, very relevant even today. Now, last July, one of your points, Marwan, in last July, we, that is the Office of the Joint Special Representative to Syria, worked with the Russian Federation and the United States to prepare for Geneva II conference that is aimed at implementing the Geneva Communique that I just referred to. Some important preparations actually have taken place, and the three parties felt that we are getting closer to the possibility of actually convening the conference. Then, as we all know, came the horrible 21st chemical attack in Ghouta, and with the very important danger imposed by the use of chemical weapons and the horrific images of the victims, the United States administration felt the need to react, the need to wage a military strike in order, as they put it, to deter the regime and degrade its capabilities. That was a position dealing basically with the chemical issues and not with the whole situation in Syria, in spite of the fact that it would have, of course, left a very fundamental and important impact on that situation. Then, and probably suddenly, although we later understood that there was some discussion between the US and the Russians, then the Russian idea to put the Syrian chemical weapons under internal control and to destroy the Syrian program. That was followed by the Syria's accession to the Convention on Chemical Weapons. Now, the United States and the Russian Federation, as we all know, actually reached a framework agreement for the elimination of the Syrian chemical weapons on 14th of September. Basically, the two agreed to work together within the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to expedite the process that is enshrined within the Convention for the destruction of the Syrian chemical weapons, and also to work with the Security Council to adopt a resolution that reinforces the decisions taken by the Executive Council of PCW. In our mind, this was a positive development, a very important development that averted the military strike and actually opened the way for potential military solution of the chemical weapon issue and maybe of the overall political situation in Syria. There has been some important discussion there has been important discussion in relation to the implementation of the Russian-American agreement, the most important part of which is the discussion that's taking place now in the Security Council. And all heard through the media about some important differences, not to say disagreements, on the exact language to be used of the resolution, and specifically with regard to the issue of chapter 7. Some P5 members are demanding the next resolution, the one that's being discussed now, to be adopted under chapter 7. Others, namely the Russians, maybe don't want any reference to chapter 7 at all. I guess, although it's a bit dangerous to guess in a situation like this, I guess that language that is very similar to the language that exists in the framework, in the Russia-American Framework Agreement, will be used as part of the resolution itself, meaning that strong language will be found. However, when it comes to Chapter 7, it probably the resolution, the draft resolution, will say something. If there is no compliance during the implementation, then the Council will adopt the necessary measures under Chapter 7. So, in other words, it might be probably the next step in this regard. Now, the question, of course, in addition to the implementation of the framework agreement, is how, if at all possible, to link this development, this important development, to the overall political context, and to actually try to expedite the Geneva process. And in this regard, indeed, on the 13th of September, there has been a trilateral meeting held in Geneva between the Americans, the Russians, and the OJSR to further discuss the preparation for Geneva. And important talks took place with regard to convening the meeting next October. Whether this will be the case, it remains to be seen. I personally expect some rough situation, given the importance of the chemical weapons issue and the some disagreements that took place there. This probably will leave some impact on the possibility of how fast the concerned parties could move. So we'll try our best to have this event in October. If not, then probably a few weeks after, but hopefully not much longer than that. Now, as Marwan said, 2 days ago, the report of the UN mission to investigate allegations of chemical weapons in Syria was presented to both the Security Council and the General Assembly. The report concludes clearly that chemical weapons were used on 21st of August on, as the report says, quote unquote, relatively large scale. It also provides clear and convincing evidence that surface-to-surface rockets containing nerve gas sarin were used. Now, overwhelming majority of people argue that with the scope of the use of the chemical weapons, with the delivery system that were used, with even the direction of the 2 rockets that were examined by the investigators, there is a convincing evidence that the attack took place or was perpetrated by the official troops, by the regime. Now, what impact this report will have is not completely clear. Again, I guess that maybe not huge impact at this stage, and the emphasis here on at this stage. Later on, I believe that the international community will come back to this report and demand certain important things, including, of course, first and foremost, the accountability. Whether this is this is going to be the issue now. Again, I think priority will be given to the overall implementation of the framework agreement and the actual destruction of the Syrian chemical weapon program. By that, I think I have already used my 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Ambassador Qudwa, thank you so much for this presentation. If I can have just a brief follow-up question. You've been, of course, talking to both the opposition and the regime in Damascus. What, in your view, are the prospects of both these groups, the opposition and the regime, going to Geneva at this stage? And have the prospects been aided or impeded by the chemical weapons issue?
Well, conventional wisdom has it that on the chemical weapons should facilitate further work and further progress on the political track. That is fairly logical thinking. However, because of the fact that there has been some people that they felt very unhappy, maybe with the framework agreement on the chemical weapons, and because of the fact that most probably that framework agreement will be put to implementation, then we might have some slight difficulties with the schedule, the timeline on how and when to move with the steps in terms of the convening of Geneva. Now, your bigger question. The government and the opposition will be willing to participate in the conference. I believe that they might. I believe that they would. However, I think the importance of positions of regional players as well as international players in this context require more importance than similar importance in other conflicts. In other words, I would be very interested to know the degree of the cooperation that countries such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and on the other hand, Iran and the Russian Federation would be ready to provide or to give to the process. This will be extremely important, regional as well as international positions of the concerned parties there. This is not to negate the importance of the local players, both the government and the opposition, but it is just to emphasize the unusual importance of positions of regional and international players.
Thank you very much. Well, perhaps with your last comments, that gives us a chance to ask Paul about these regional reactions. What, Paul, do you think the reaction of regional countries such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and others are? But I also would like to ask you to make maybe a few comments about what is the reaction of Arab public opinion, not just the governments, to the Russian-US agreement, and whether you think the aversion of war, at least at this stage, has been seen positively or negatively, not just by Arab governments, but also by Arab public opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly it's been all that everybody has been talking about in the last few days. First of all, the perception of and how people are reading whether this is strengthens the Syrian regime, weakens it, how it impacts the opposition, how it impacts the conflict in Syria in general, and then how the different regional players are reacting to it, and what perception there is of the superpower, who won, who lost, who is more powerful. First of all, there's no doubt that it in the short term, it certainly buys the Syrian regime time. It averted a major strike. They're certainly better off without a U.S. strike than they win with the U.S. strike, and the loss of the chemical weapons in the short term does not impact the war internally that much, although it might have long-term consequences. So short term, there's a sense that the opposition, which looking forward to a measure by the U.S. that would change the internal balance of power dramatically and would engage the U.S. in the Syrian conflict. The fact that that is not happening certainly makes the regime look more secure in the short term and has a major bullet. It's not lost on people that President Assad now is, in a sense, somewhat legitimated internationally because he is now a partner to the implementation of a very important chemical weapons agreement that will take him at least through the middle of 2014, and there will likely delays, so at least through the rest of 2014. In a sense, he's been given a legitimation even by the U.S. and others who were just, talking about he should leave just a few months ago. The allies of the Syrian regime, like Hezbollah, for example, have been painting this sort of as a victory. Of course, that's expected. They would paint it as such. But their version of events is that Syria, with the backing of Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah, made it very clear to the U.S. that a U.S. strike would have major strategic and military consequences. Their twist on events is that the U.S. was looking for a way to back out of the confrontation, and that the Russians came up with this deal sort of to find an exit for the U.S. So in their media and their public opinion, that's how they're telling it, that this was sort of a victory for their axis, and that the concession, they're painting it as not an important one. Strategically, however, the loss of Syria's chemical weapons is a major strategic loss for Syria, if indeed, they end up really giving them up. This has been a major pillar of Syria's strategic deterrence against Israel, and, behind Israel, potentially the U.S. Many people that I've talked to here in Lebanon, even members of the opposition, are enraged that Assad would give up a sort of a strategic asset of Syria just to save himself. In a way, like many Iranians view the nuclear program as a national issue, there's a sense of that in Syria. It's also on people that the last Arab dictators to give up chemical weapons or WMDs, like Gaddafi in Libya in 2003, and to some degree Saddam Hussein, ended up not protected but removed from power in the long run. So I would say short term, the regime looks secure. Long term, perhaps more fragile or more vulnerable in the long term. The opposition, you'd have to talk about two opposites, the Free Syrian Army and the jihadist groups. The jihadist groups were feared. I mean, of course, they would have been happy with any striking the Assad regime, but they were preparing for the U.S. to strike them as well. And they certainly considered that if the U.S. were to get engaged in Syria, the U.S. would be going after them as well. So for the jihadist groups, they might also be breathing a sigh of relief that the U.S. is not getting engaged. They can continue on their own terms without the U.S. Becoming influential in Syria. So the big losers really are just the Syrian army, I would say, who is very upset, feels betrayed and abandoned. In the region, it's no secret that Turkey and the Gulf Cooperation Councils expected and want and still want, a major, they wanted a major military strike. They wanted serious engagement. They want to go all out for regime change, and they think that needs to be done militarily. Certainly, they're very unhappy with the American climb down as they see it. They don't see the chemical weapons issue as, yes, it's significant, but it's not at all something that will resolve the Syrian crisis in any shape or form. They also fear that now that the President has taken care of this sort of red line that he talked about, and that this could go on for years, he will long way to engage seriously in the Syrian conflict. They're clearly very upset and very unhappy. Region, I would say, it's only Lebanon and Jordan who sighed a sigh of relief that there would not be another massive wave of refugees and more destabilization in their countries, which are already suffering considerably. In terms of the perception of where this puts U.S. and Russia in the Middle East, I would say that it's a diplomatic victory for Russia. Certainly, President Obama does not appear, powerful or in a strong persona or leadership, but that the U.S. threat, even without going through with it, led to Syria and its Russian ally convincing Syria to give up its strategic weapons, still indicates to many people that Russia cannot counterbalance the U.S. strategically. This is still very dominant militarily, even if its president currently is very hesitant, and there's a perception that it's not clear that he knows what he's doing. But it's still not lost on people that when the U.S. rattled its sabers, at the end of the day, couldn't come up with anything better than convincing its client to give up its weapons. Not a very reassuring strategic position for Russia's, strategic presence in the region, but definitely sort of a diplomatic. Putin is seen as very deft and very impressive, although Russia as a strategic power not still comparable to what the U.S. can still wield in the region. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Paul. That brings us to the U.S. Debate, Andrew, and the Russian position as well. How, in your view, has the U.S. handled this? Some people predict or look at this as a victory, maybe a small one for President Obama. Others see this as resulting in a weakened presidency, in a weakened image of the U.S. Around the region. So what are your views?
Thank you, Marwan, and thank you all for coming today. I think it's hard to overstate the cumulative, corrosive impact that this crisis has had on U.S.-Russian relations. While I won't try to sit here and defend what Russia has been doing in Syria, I'm also, I'd say, very uncomfortable with a administration strategy which has, over time, I think, allowed this conflict to become a contest of wills between Washington and Moscow and created a bilateral issue when, in fact, this is much more regional and complex sectarian conflict on the ground. I think over time, U.S. policy has suffered from a misportrayal seriatim of what Russia's role is. If we divide it into phases, at the beginning of the conflict in 2011, up to the G8 meeting at Camp David in May 2012, there's been this expectation that Russia might magically play the role of facilitating a political settlement in the conflict, similar to what Saudi Arabia did in Yemen. And that hope, I think, was dashed in the end by the conversation the president had with then Prime Minister Medvedev at Camp David in May 2012. Throughout that period, I think Russia played along on the diplomatic track, while in fact it believed that Assad could actually shoot his way out of a very grinding and bloody civil war. Over the course of the summer 2012, U.S. policy shifted rather dramatically to portraying Russia as a primary enabler and military supplier to the Assad regime, while maybe downplaying the role that Iran was playing. So you had the big showdown over the attack helicopters shipment in the summer of 2012. And then you had a series of double vetoes by Russia and China and the Security Council. And I would argue that during the U.S. political campaign season, the U.S. had an interest in playing up the Russian and Chinese role at the Security Council as a way of saying, oh, we would be doing more, but for these obstinate and obstructionist tactics by the Russians and the Chinese. And I think that sort of image that the road to military action or some form of U.S.-led Western involvement in the crisis was thwarted by what was going on in New York, I think was very convenient for the administration. After August 21st, I think the rhetoric and the view of what Russia was doing again shifted rather dramatically, and there was all this rhetoric about how Russia was Assad's main patron, that Russia was in fact had a sort of client relationship with Assad. We didn't want to go back to the Security Council because the Russians had systematically blocked the effectiveness of the Security Council. When in fact I think some of the reluctance was that we were going to lose more votes than we had had in the previous showdowns that led to these 3 double vetoes. And then dramatically, of course, everyone knows what happened on the margins of the G20 meeting in St. Petersburg, and then the announcement of this possible U.S.-Russian initiative. I think I give Secretary Kerry a lion's share of the credit here for not engaging in a lot of the trash talking and the disparaging of the Russian role, but trying to maintain channels, trying to demonstrate that his longstanding relationship with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov could produce results. I think if you look at the second element of this, which is what does Russia actually want, I don't think the U.S. has done itself any favors. In the political debate, it's not done itself any favors by misportraying what Russia wants. We've seen a lot of loose talk about a new Cold War, competition by proxy, Russia's desire for a warm water port, this sense that Russia is the main military backer for Assad. I think if you look at what Russia really wants and what Putin really wants here, there are three elements. First is they don't want to see a repeat of this Libya precedent where the UN Security Council basically uses humanitarian concerns to justify some form of military intervention led either by the U.S. or by its Arab partners. There's deep anxiety in Moscow about the unfolding Sunni-Shia clash that we see on the ground in Syria, and a fear that if the Sunni monarchies get the upper hand, that either that will lead to increased pressure on Iran, or it could lead to a sort of set of initiatives by the Sunni monarchies to finance insurgencies in radical Islam, either along Russia's periphery or inside Russia itself. And then finally, I think there's a real lack of confidence in the U.S. ability to manage the crisis. And so the sense that the U.S. can deal with Assad's removal, that it can deal with the consequences from Syria's emergence as a fractured or failed society, that won't either create a new ungoverned area similar to what we've had in Pakistan, which would emanate instability and create shockwaves across the region and into Russia itself. There's just no confidence in Moscow and Washington's ability to manage that. So, I think at the end, what we've seen here, and Paul and our colleague from Geneva both illustrated this, is a sense that the U.S. is uncertain of what it wants, that there's great reluctance in White House, I think understandable, and I would share that reluctance to get more directly involved. All of that has created a strategic vacuum and a lot of running room for the Russians to portray themselves as really big players here. The question is what do the Russians do? Now that they have that role, I think we've seen a desire by the Russians to play the role of Syria's lawyer or advocate, most recently in what's going on in the discussions in New York on a possible UNSCR under Chapter 7. But what I think folks haven't focused on as much, what I think we really need to look at are what are the limits of Russian influence over Assad. There's a real sense here that the Russians have, the ability to deliver Assad. I'm not so sure about that. There's a lot of history over the past decade in which the Assad regime, even before it faced this existential crisis, basically was able to wave away Russian requests and Russian influence. So again, it's a very fluid situation, but I would be very cautious about just how much of what the Russians claim they're able to deliver they can actually deliver.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And that brings us to Iran, Karim. Has Iran's calculus changed as a result of this latest agreement regarding their own nuclear issue? Some people think that they are now more likely to pursue their nuclear program, others less likely. How would you see that?
Four broad points with regards to the questions. The first is that I haven't seen any signs, any tangible signs that Iran is preparing to abandon Assad. Iran has two pretty clear interests in Syria. One is to maintain a long-standing alliance. This is arguably their only long-standing alliance since the 1979 revolution, and it's to preserve a corridor to Hezbollah. And I think if Iran was confident that it could preserve its interests in Syria if Assad were to fall, they would have cut him loose a long time ago. But I think they're certainly not confident about that, and for that reason, I would argue there's no signs they're preparing to abandon Assad, and on the contrary, there are some tangible signs that they've doubled down on Assad, whether it's setting up Shiite militia training camps on the borders with Iran and Iraq, including Iraqi Shiites, statements from the head of the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, proclaiming to support Syria to the end. So I think Iran's role is really one of the fundamental challenges in a diplomatic solution, because if one side of a conflict sees it as a zero-sum game, it's very difficult to meet halfway in a zero-sum game. With regards, this is the second point, with regards to whether or not U.S. policy toward Syria has a bearing on Iran's nuclear ambitions, there's kind of two arguments which have been made. The first argument is that U.S. inaction in Syria will embolden Iran to move forward with their nuclear ambitions because they no longer take the United States seriously. The second argument is to counter that, to say that on the contrary, U.S. action, U.S. military action in Syria will compel Iran to pursue a nuclear deterrent. My sense is that U.S. action or inaction in Syria won't really have a strong bearing on Iran's nuclear ambitions. If we were having this conversation 2 months ago, 3 months ago, I would have said that Iran's nuclear ambitions are to pursue, in a very deliberate fashion, a nuclear weapons capability, to kind of get up to the point where they're a screwdriver turn away from having a nuclear weapon, but not yet turning that screw. And I think that will remain the case whether the U.S. chooses to bomb Syria or not bomb Syria. I will see Iran continuing to pursue a nuclear weapons capability in a very deliberate fashion. So I don't see the strong linkage between the two. The third point I'd make is that there have been many op-eds written over the last months and weeks about the need to engage Iran over Syria in order to find a diplomatic resolution in Syria. And I certainly don't oppose those efforts, but I would say that Iran's role in Syria is not organic in the same way that Iran's role in Afghanistan or Iran's role in Iraq has been. These are two countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, in which Iran shares enormous borders. There's been centuries of trade, and Iran truly does have an organic influence in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it will for decades and centuries to come. I don't think that's the case in Syria. There's no border between Iran and Syria. It's not an organic alliance between two nations, but it's really what I describe as a tactical come strategic partnership between two authoritarian regimes. But between the societies, despite the fact that Iran has spent billions of dollars since 1979 subsidizing Iranians' travel to Syria, and I think the Syrian regime likewise has tried to foster warm feelings among Syrians for Iran. But, it's just kind of this arranged marriage in which the two partners, I would argue, the two societies never really fell in love. I think that goes back to the previous point that's why, in a way, Iran is really doubled and tripled down on Assad, because if they felt confident that they were going to preserve a strong role in Syria when Assad falls, I think we would have cut him loose long ago. The last point I'll make is with regards to U.S.-Iran relations, particularly the potential for some type of a nuclear detente. I argued earlier I don't see any tangible signs that Iran is preparing to abandon Assad. But I would say that there are several data points to suggest that Iran is preparing itself, preparing its public for a process which could lead to a nuclear compromise. I've never been terribly optimistic about these things. So I think there's been several statements from people who matter. I don't follow kind of what reformist intellectuals opine about in Tehran about the nuclear issue, about Syria. But when Ayatollah Khamenei, as he did yesterday, told a group of Revolutionary Guardsmen that Iran needed to show, quote unquote, heroic flexibility, that's pretty significant. And there's a lot of other signs from President Rouhani and others to show that, again, it's not that they're going to give up their nuclear ambitions next week at the UN General Assembly, but they are floating a lot of trial balloons, and they seem to be preparing themselves for a process. And the last thing I'd say about that is that what's interesting is that we went in a period of 2 months from the very worst of the Islamic Republic to the very best of the Islamic Republic. Iran's current foreign minister, Javad Zarif, who was formerly Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, I would argue is Iran's most sophisticated and effective diplomat in the history of the Islamic Revolution. In the last 35 years, I haven't met a single Iranian official I would say is more sophisticated or understanding of the world, and particularly of the United States, than Zarif. And I think this creates a conundrum. It's somewhat of a double-edged sword for the United States and particularly for Israel. Because on one hand, Iran is now easier to engage, but on the other hand, it's going to be more difficult to isolate. The person, I would argue, who deserves most credit for this robust international sanctions regime is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And now that he's gone, it's going to be difficult to maintain those robust international coalition, especially, as Andrew was arguing, the fraying ties between Washington and Moscow as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Karim. It's very insightful. So you've just heard a rich variety of views from experts following the different perspectives regarding this crisis. I'm not going to monopolize this conversation, so let me go straight to the question and answer session. We have a lot of people. Again, if you can identify yourself, and we'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time. Sir.
I'm a consultant for the World Bank. However far away it may be, however hypothetical, can one start to imagine what a political settlement in Syria might one day look like? To my uninformed thinking, words like cantons come to mind, some kind of system which gives the different communities a good deal of autonomy over their own affairs, but imagining how armed forces would be controlled at local and national levels is well beyond my pay.
Yes, sir.
Mohammed Yunus from the Gallup Organization. I just want to get the view of some of the panelists on the realistic nature of pursuing decommissioning a WMD program in the middle of a civil war. How realistic is that to actually happen or succeed to some degree? And if it doesn't succeed, what would the U.S.'s position and others what would be their next move at that point?
Yes, Mona.
Mona Yakubian from the Stimson Center. This question is for both Andrew and Karim, and I'd be curious as to your views on the issue of chemical weapons use and how that may or may not have informed, Andrew, in your case, Russia's position, potential shift, and Karim, in your case, there is this speculation that Iran's abhorrence of chemical weapons use because of its own experience in the Iran-Iraq war may in fact shape its views on what to do with Syria. Thanks.
Yes, sir. In the back.
Good morning. My name is Mazhar Samman. My question is to Mr. Paul Salem. Yesterday, Mr. Ali Haider, who is the Minister of National Reconciliation in Syria, claimed that the agreement between the U.S. and Russia is a great victory for Syria. Is that the sense exist in the region as you sense it? Thank you.
Ambassador Qudwa, do you want to start with what a political settlement might look like, since you worked on it and have been working on it for quite some time?
Well, of course, it's a very difficult question to answer. However, let me deal, if I heard the question correctly, there was a reference or sub-question about the possibilities of federalism or cantons or anything of the sort. If the need was part of the question as I heard it, then would be that it's very difficult to achieve something like that through a political solution. We might end up with an state as it did exist in the past. And that would mean maybe at some point informal cantons, separate regions, separate areas, state of war among each other, or maybe in a bit more peaceful arrangement or relationship. That might be the case. It might happen. However, for the political itself to lead orderly fashion through agreement among the parties to this kind of decentralized system, frankly, I have my doubt about that. Now, one has to take into consideration the Kurdish claim, insistence on some kind of special arrangements, maybe autonomy, maybe a little bit more or a little bit less. That has dealt with, but this is a special case. I don't think that we can apply the same on other communities or other possible regions. The political solution in general would, as I indicated in my introduction, I believe comes from the Geneva Communique with all its ambiguous nature. The crux of the matter is the political transition, and central to this is the formation of a government, an agreed upon government with full executive powers, that is all powers that the state has. This was as far as the parties who participated in Fair Geneva were able to agree upon when it comes to the status of President Bashar al-Assad. This means that the president is not going to keep enjoying any powers because of the fact that all powers will go to this transitional governing body, a transitional government that would be reached by mutual consent. The overall idea is to keep the institutions of the state in return for a complete and comprehensive political change leading to a true democratic Syria that is a place for all its citizens with equal rights for everybody. It's very difficult to achieve, I understand that, but I think that this political framework is the only realistically possible framework that regional and international can agree upon. Thank you.
Paul?
Yes, I mean, I would certainly agree with what Ambassador Qudwa said, but my perspective is not so much to focus on the imagined, eventual resolution that might happen, but more on, the reality that might be the case for many years to come. I mean, as I said in a meeting in D.C. a few months ago, I mean, Geneva II is great, but perhaps we'll need a Geneva to finally reach the end of this conflict. Unfortunately, I really see no serious willingness neither among the regime or among the opposition factions and the positions they hold, particularly after all this intense violence has taken place. I would wish for a resolution soon, but I think it's in terms of many years rather than months. A focus that needs to be part of international and regional attention is more on conflict de-escalation, conflict management, focus on ceasefires, focus on humanitarian relief, to figure out how 23 million Syrians are going to live through a situation which will remain in crisis without resolution probably for many years to come. That, in my mind, should be one of the major focuses of Geneva II, and certainly is something that perhaps we can have some successes on, even if we don't reach a settle. At the end of the day, Syria certainly will have to be if there ever is agreement years down the road, it will certainly have to be somewhat decentralized, have to be power sharing with different arrangements. But that really takes leaders that are willing to do it. That means leaders that are exhausted enough to make major compromises, leaders that have enough of a power base to commit, power base oppositions that are unified, their base with them. None of those conditions, in my mind, are present today. On the other question, since I have the floor, that was raised by Mr. Samman as to is the regime in Syria projecting this as a victory? Yes, in terms of propaganda, not surprisingly, pretty much everything they try to paint as a victory, and so is Hezbollah. But I see perception in the region is Syria and Russia have cleverly avoided a major blow and have entangled the U.S. in a long process through which it's probably going to strike again in the term. So that is, it's also not lost on people that Syria had to give up something quite significant, and that Syria is, yes, weaker today than it was a month ago, but not at all as weak as it would have been if it's gone ahead and dropped.
3 points about the prospects for a political solution, at least with regards to Iran. Former senior Iranian official, very close aide to Rouhani, said to me not long ago that we need to, quote unquote, find the Syrian Karzai, which would be essentially someone who belongs to the Sunni demographic majority and is palatable to various international actors, including the United States and Iran. I would just say two things. One, the Karzai model hasn't exactly worked out fantastically in Afghanistan. And second, I just can't imagine a scenario whereby a Sunni Arab would succeed Assad in Syria and want to maintain an alliance with Iran and continue to allow Iran to use Syrian territory to arm and finance Hezbollah. I don't see that within the realm of possibilities. And again, that's why this conflict has proven to be so intractable. There was a question, a very good question about the prospects for decommissioning chemical weapons in a civil war. I have no expertise on this, but I would just point you to a very interesting interview which Angela Kane, who's the head of UN's disarmament, did with National Public Radio yesterday. And she said, essentially, that's never been done before. There's no precedent of that happening. So it's something which is going to be incredibly difficult. She didn't say impossible, but it's a very tall order. And then last, on the issue of chemical weapons and how Iran may or has responded to this, given that they themselves suffered a chemical weapons attack from Saddam Hussein. I would argue that the way they've morally reconciled this is to blame the rebels for the chemical attack. There was only one data point, only one suggestion from former President Rafsanjani speaking off the cuff, saying that Syrians had suffered chemical weapons attack at the hands of their government. 2 days later, he rescinded that, and he claimed that it was actually the rebels and it was outside powers who were responsible for that. Now that Iran has opened up slightly, there are more of these kind of folks around the government who are allowed to come to D.C. One is actually in town right now. Someone very close to Rouhani said it's the belief of not only kind of the Revolutionary Guards, but also even the more moderate Rouhani factions, that it was the rebels who used chemical weapons, not the regime, which is essentially, if I'm not mistaken, Andrew, the Russian position as well. So I think that's how they've managed to morally reconcile that fact.
Andrew?
So back to Ms. Abdo's question about what role did the possible use by the regime of chemical weapons have in catalyzing Russian behavior? I'd say that, first and foremost, everyone's focused on the question of why is Russia being more Syrian than the Syrians and somehow, suggesting that all this can be traced back to the rebels. I think we have to remember that what the Russians have been about here is forestalling U.S. military action and avoiding creating any juridical basis in the UN Security Council or elsewhere that would give the U.S. and others license to act militarily. That creates, I think, an intellectual trap for the Russians where they can't come out and now change their position that, oh, I guess you're right, the regime was responsible. And we see in the text of the Kerry-Lavrov agreement from this weekend no ability of the Russians to ascribe responsibility for the attack to the regime. And I think that's going to be a big stumbling block in New York as people hammer out the resolution. At the same time, the Russians do, as a former superpower, feel a sense of responsibility when it comes to enforcing proliferation norms. And I think it's really an underexplored element of what happened in the past 10 days to look at the kind of dialogue that the U.S. and Russians have been conducting in secret. That began back in spring of 2012. I think the kickoff was a visit by then National Security Staff Senior Director and Special Assistant to the President, Gary Seymour, to start a dialogue with the Russians about CW contingencies. Kerry has alluded to these secret discussions in a couple of instances in public, but I think it's a good thing to remember that channels were going somewhat actively. I wouldn't overstate their effectiveness given how the Russians view sharing sensitive information and given the Russian reluctance to do anything that would have been a cudgel for the U.S. to put pressure on Assad over the past 18 months. But if you look even in the text of the agreement, I think it's in Annex B of the agreement, there's a reference to this very unusual term, a universal matrix that was developed by U.S. Russian experts on Syria's CW arsenal. So again, there's been a platform, and I think Kerry was very creative in trying to tap into this basis of work. Right now, will we see that level of trust and cooperation help us in the middle of a war zone to develop a workable plan? I think much of the burden is going to fall on the United States and on the Western powers to do the hard work and to build the capability to implement what is a very ambitious timeline for destruction of the Syrian arsenal. And I think this is going to be a process that is going to be so heavily fraught, so in the spotlight, so subject to reversals and sort of perils of Pauline dynamics that I think it's going to be a very painful and halting process to watch. And anyone who watched what happened after the Gulf War in terms of how Saddam Hussein cheated and retreated and blocked and hampered the role of the inspectors, shouldn't be naive about Assad's strategy here, which is going to be extremely confrontational and non-cooperative. So it comes back to my original point. We need to test how much influence Russia actually has over Assad. My sense is it's limited. And we should be prepared for this process to be filled with lots of heartbreak and lots of limited and halting steps.
Okay. Second round, please.
Hi, I haven't heard anybody say anything about Israel yet, and I know Netanyahu is supposed to be coming September 30th here, and what kind of influence is he going to have on this?
Okay. Yes, Rami in the back.
Thank you. My name is Rami Kharabshia from the Embassy of Jordan. I have a couple of questions regarding the regional impact of the Syrian crisis. First one is, what kind of scenarios are we to expect with the different scenarios on the table for treating the Syrian situation regarding the refugees? If a certain scenario is adopted regarding treating the Syrian issue, what is the impact on the Syrian refugees for the near future and the far future? The second question is about, we have very important point discussing the Russian and the Iranian influence on this issue. But how do you view the Russian-Iranian interaction in this field and the priorities of the two parties? How do they interact and where do they cross? Thank you.
Please. The woman here, please.
Hi, Martha Wexler from NPR. I just wanted to follow up with Mr. Weiss on the Russian insistence again this morning that it was the rebels who carried out this chemical weapons attack and how big an obstacle that will be for working out a resolution. I mean, it's looking like it could be really a stumbling block here.
One more? Yes.
Jesse Thomas, currently unaffiliated. This is also for Mr. Weiss. I was intrigued by Mr. Putin's op-ed in the New York Times last week. I just wanted to hear your opinion on the unprecedented method that he used, also the content he had in the op-ed. Do you think that this shows political desperation in Russia or maybe confidence in their views? Just wanted to hear your opinion.
Okay. Who wants to take the first shot?
I'm happy to do it.
Why don't you go?
Okay. So on the Russian-Iranian interaction, I think there's a really interesting question about what kind of division of labor was established and how it was established. I don't think any of this was going to be public, but as anyone who read Monday's Wall Street Journal front page article about the extent of Iranian training of Shia militiamen in this camp outside of Tehran, and the footage that came out also earlier this week showing Iranian military personnel or intelligence personnel engaged in leading troops into battle. Clearly the Iranians played the lion's share, and Hezbollah played the lion's share, have performed the lion's share of putting boots on the ground and helping turn the tide militarily. At the same time, Russia seems to have played a role, and increasing spotlight folks may not have focused on is the letter that I think it's 3 or 4 senators published on Friday, Kelly Ayotte, Ralph Blumenthal, I can't remember who the other 2 were, so it's 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat, about Russian apparent financial support for the regime. And so Russia seems to have provided a kind of conduit for the Syrian central bank and others to have access to the international financial system. I wouldn't overstate the significance of this, given that there aren't international sanctions in place against the regime, but it's provided a bit of a escape route from the EU and US unilateral sanctions packages. And I think, it'll be very interesting to see how Congress puts pressure on the administration to try to sanction some of the Russian banks, which often are very politically connected and very important state-owned banks, to do more. The administration, I think, is going to have a very tough time fending off those requests. On the question about assigning blame in the debate in the Security Council, I think we're going to end up, basically back where we were in the Geneva Agreement, where the administration has to fudge and if it wants Russian approval for a new resolution that codifies the Geneva Agreement, and it will have to basically accede to the view that use happened, but without assigning blame. Because again, there's no independent, impartial document that the Security Council representatives can point to. The report that came out this week doesn't actually finger the regime. And so I think it'll be very hard for anyone to take it on the U.S. say-so, least of all the Russians. So I think we're basically stuck on in a formulation which was hammered out in Geneva. I can't see the Russians going beyond that. And then on the op-ed, I think, the Russian view, which was delivered, I'd say, with a tin ear in terms of the political sensitivities here, and also, I'd say, frankly, in a way that really missed the opportunity at a time when the world really wanted to hear what Putin thought. He basically tried to trash the United States, talked about U.S. exceptionalism, all these things that hit a nerve here. The Russians, I think, are relishing their role in the spotlight, but aren't realizing, again, just how bad the image problem is. And they missed an opportunity, and this is the classic Churchill formulation of how the Russians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But here was this chance to really show that Putin is a peacemaker, and Putin, sees a bigger unifying purpose here, but instead it descended into a lot of finger-pointing and trash-talking. I don't think there's anything unprecedented. American presidents have used similar op-eds to go over the heads of the Russian interlocutors to reach a mass audience in Russia. Putin himself has done that in the United States as well. So, but again, what it was amazing to me is here was this amazing platform and moment for Putin to really shine and to show that Russia wants some sort of more desirable world in which there are all these things that various people from various political from various parts of the political spectrum could all sign on to, and he just wasn't able to execute that.
Ambassador Qudwa, you've been involved in negotiations with Israel, and we have not talked about the Israeli angle. What, in your view, would that be? How does Netanyahu look at the Syrian crisis? Is it aiding or impeding, Israel's position? And also to Paul, you're the recipient of one of the largest number of refugees that have come out of the Syrian crisis, your country, I mean. a very important question: is the refugee situation sustainable? And if the war goes on, what are countries like Lebanon and Jordan to do with this very large number of refugees? So maybe we start with Nasser.
All right, I was hoping to skip this one, but anyway. No,
That's why you have a moderator here, too.
No, I believe that would feel satisfied with the actual accomplishment of the destruction of the Syrian chemical weapons, and thus would feel satisfied with the implementation of the framework agreement and seeing results in this regard. That would be a very important milestone of the balance of power, if you wish, or power of horror, what you want to call it. However, at the same time, I feel that the Israelis would want to make sure that this is not going to have an impact on potential military strike against Iran if at a later stage. I, of course, took note of what Karim said, and I think he was right in terms of no on the Iranian position itself. But this is maybe not the only point. The other point, which what kind of impact all this might have on the American decisions in the context of to do later on with Iran. Is this kind of maybe even ambivalent feeling, maybe ambivalent position that are being expressed by different Israeli officials. On the issue of the cooperation with the Iranians, I just simply would say that yes, in my opinion, there is very close cooperation, even coordination of position in terms of. Nevertheless, I also believe that national interest and strategies are not the same. Of course, sometimes in an important way. We have seen the manifestation of that in terms of the Russian idea and the framework agreement with the United States on the chemical weapons. So I don't think that the Iranians necessarily are very happy with the whole thing. On the issue of the Russian resistance on who's to blame, actually I don't find this kind of discussion on the perpetrator of the chemical attack useful at this stage. And I also agree with the point of view that we will witness the implementation of the framework agreement, and the expected Security Council resolution will reflect that framework agreement. Thank you.
Paul?
Yeah, well, the refugee issue obviously is a very major one for countries in the region, particularly Lebanon and Jordan, also the Kurdish region in Iraq, and less so in Turkey and Iraq proper. The numbers are huge. Already 2 million Syrians have already left Syria. Many hundreds of thousands more expected to leave in the months to come. 1/4 of the population of Lebanon is now Syrians, either refugees, official refugees, or 600,000-700,000 Syrians who are in the country, not registered refugees. The risks are enormous. Already burden on the economy, on the infrastructure, both in Lebanon and Jordan, is an enormous burden to keep up with the needs of this population. The international community and the regional community, yes, has provided support, certainly not to the level that is needed. The rich Gulf countries certainly have not provided the aid that they could have provided to address this issue. In terms of scenarios, I mean, most people that I talk to here in the region really do not at all expect a solution of the Syrian crisis anytime soon. and hence, the options that they look at, either that the current numbers will stay or they will get much larger. Those are sort of the two realistic scenarios. That's why, I mentioned the urgent need to de-escalate the Syrian conflict, that if it's not going to be resolved, there are ways to de-escalate it, reduce the refugee flows, to allow people to go back to town villages in various parts of Syria, their homes rebuild, their lives rebuild, local economies, even if the country remains divided without an overall resolution. The Lebanese civil war with it took 16 years to come to an end. But for most of those years, fairly de-escalated, people went about their lives, the local economies adjusted, there was not a massive refugee outflow from the country. This has not yet happened in Syria, and I don't see any or regional emphasis on de-escalation. It's either Asian will bomb them or we'll try to resolve it. Neither the bombing is going to resolve it or attempt at getting Assad to sit down with Jabhat al-Nusra and the Free Syrian Army tomorrow is a resolution. In the meantime, 150 dead, 9 million, 10 million displaced. This is not a tolerable situation. The risk to Lebanon in particular is very high. Jordan has more of a central government. They've all established camps where people can keep more of an eye on things. Lebanon has not established any camps. The Syrian refugees, 700,000 registered refugees, are in every town and village and neighborhood in Lebanon. So far, nobody from the regional players has chosen to mobilize or arm. But if any player anywhere, including Al-Qaeda, is to seriously take the fight against Hezbollah and Lebanon and to use some of these young men, Lebanon certainly would probably not be able to handle that and perhaps implode. I think the risks are very high. Attention to de-escalation must be part of the international approach.
Okay, any of you would like to?
Well, I just said a couple of quick things. I think Nasser's point about Israel in response to your question was it was a really important one. That for Israel, I think, which is constantly focused on Iran and Iran's nuclear ambitions, what's been most significant about the last several weeks, if they've seen the U.S. Reluctance to take military action, and what impact this has on their thinking about the fact that they may have to, they may be on their own with regards to Iran's nuclear ambitions is to me yet unclear. But I think that's certainly something which has quite frankly upset them, because they feel like they are not confident that if faced with a binary choice, which I don't think we'll actually get to that binary choice, either Iran acquiring a bomb or Iran being bombed, but I think Israel is sensing that the U.S. is going to be reluctant to act. But it does show how convoluted the Middle East is when Israel's two key adversaries, Iran and Hezbollah. You would think that if Assad falls, if that's bad for Iran and it's bad for Hezbollah, then it's good for Israel. But they seem to be, hedging their bets, whether or not that's good for them. And I just say one thing about the Russia-Iran relationship, which I would argue is one of the most anomalous relationships in international affairs today, because it's, again, not based on a natural alliance between two countries. It's basically it's premised on this mutual competition and in some cases contempt they have vis-a-vis the United States. Henry Kissinger once said about U.S.-Iran relations, he said there are few nations in the world with whom the United States has more common interests and less reason to quarrel than Iran. From Iran's perspective, I would turn that quote on its head with regards to Russia. There are few nations in the world with whom Iran has less common interests and more reason to quarrel than Russia. Russia is probably the most hated country in Iran at a popular level. But I think what's sustaining their friendship or their alliance at the moment, again, is this mutual competition, in the case of Iran, perhaps contempt for America. But we're going to look back on this, decades from now and say that this was really an aberration. It wasn't a natural alliance.
All right, let's take one last round, please.
Thank you. Rebecca de Guzman, U.S. Special Operations Command. A question came up about Israel. Let's focus on Israel for a moment. How about Turkey? Given the importance the panel has placed on regional and international actors, what is the U.S. Is it clear what the U.S. would like to see from Turkey, and what will shape the policy there?
Okay, please.
Hi, my question direct at Paul, and could you? My question is, what's the actual situation on the ground in Syria? The balance of power between the government and the rebel forces, and as well as within the rebel forces, the balance of power between the moderate force and the radical forces. Thank you.
Woman over there.
Hi, Ann Halley of Middle East and North Africa Consultants Association. My question is for anyone regarding the Arab League, and what should their role be in this crisis, and what has it been so far?
Okay, yes, sir.
Ryan McCann. I just wanted to know what sources of information are folks using to gauge the evolving attitude of Syrian citizens on the ground?
Okay. Start with Paul.
The situation in Syria, I will try to summarize, follows. The regime sent the capital and the west of the country largely. Various opposition forces hold the north and the east, and parts of the southwest. 50-50 in terms of geography and more or less in terms of population. The capital itself is contested, so there are neighborhoods in where obviously the regime is mostly dominant, but the neighborhoods which are completely controlled by various rebel forces. In the rebel-held areas, it's very distributed. There are obviously almost 1,000 different local and militias of different sizes. Roughly, it's about half and half in terms of radical jihadist groups, which have become very significant and hold a number of towns and regions in northeastern Syria, and other groups loosely under the umbrella of the more moderate, less radical, and in some cases leftist or nationalist Free Syrian Army. So hence there is certainly a geographic division. Of course, then there's the obviously Kurdish areas in Qamishli and the northeast, which are held by Kurdish groups supported by Kurdish groups in KRG in northern Iraq. So that's sort of the map. The rebel forces, as I said, are not at all one group. Unlike the regime, where the regime is the regime, in its areas there's state institutions. The rebel-held areas are very, very chaotic, very insecure, both because of either repressive and rapid behavior by some jihadi groups or imposing sort of Taliban-style Sharia rule on the inhabitants, which are rather aghast at this form of radical Islam that it was never part of their life, or sort of mafia-style militia behavior of some of the Free Syrian Army groups who, use their power, abuse their power in various ways. In addition, areas are pounded by Syrian artillery, so they're also not secure in terms of being rebel-held areas. The balance, there is, in a sense, power only in the rough sense that the regime no longer can realistically imagine winning. In other words, winning back the country, I think, is pretty much out of the question, even in their mind. And at the time being, the rebels really have no realistic expectation of winning anytime soon, particularly there now is a very deep split between the jihadists and the non-jihadi forces. So I would say that's roughly the situation. The jihadis get money and arms from private networks in the Gulf and the Islamic world. The Free Syrian Army hoped and expected to get a lot of support from the region and from the West, and it really has not to any significant degree. And I would say it's the weakest group today inside Syria. Syrian citizens, that's a very good question, and there is no, reliable way to really gauge it. Obviously, we all try to do our best following all kinds of sources. Some of it is social media, some of it is seeing as many people as we can. But I would summarize the situation that, if anything, the overwhelming feeling of Syrian citizens now is despair, rather than, a sense that, support the opposition and they will win and we will have a better Syria, support the regime, they will win and we'll have a better Syria. There's a sinking feeling among most Syrians I talk, maybe pro-regime, pro-opposition, or may have been, that effectively there is no winner to this fight, and deep, deep despair that they are effectively lost Syria as they knew it, as a society, as an economy, state, and they really see no quick end in sight. I'd make a comment about the Arab League, because we didn't mention Egypt in all of this. It's quite clear that the Gulf Cooperation Council, who is very influential in the League, wanted to strike and is very hostile to the Assad regime. Sisi-led, as it were, government in Egypt, military government of that opinion is not in favor of not in favor of U.S. strike, not in favor of weakening the Assad regime so much that Islamists would gain the upper hand. So you find Egypt in the Arab League sort of put the brakes on a decision that might have come out in support of a strike. At the end of the day, did not, like the case of Libya.
Ambassador Qudwa, perhaps you would like to comment on the Arab League issue?
Yes, cautiously, nevertheless. But before that, I just want very quickly to say that with regard to discussion, finding political solution versus serious de-escalation of the situation as a necessary period before you will reach political settlement. Unfortunately, I think it would be extremely difficult to achieve serious de-escalation of situation separate from a serious political solution, or at least the first few steps in this regard. And this is for several reasons, the most important of which is what Paul mentioned about the strength and presence of the extremists in jihad and all kinds of things. We are talking about thousands of people. This is only one of the reasons why, in my opinion, it would be very difficult. But this is only a point of view, and it's obviously doesn't enjoy consensus. With regard to the Arab League, Arab League actually started very well with this conflict. It tried to do something with the beginning of the conflict. And it took initiatives. It even sent servers to Syria with the aim of helping to achieve a ceasefire. It coordinated with the United Nations in the form of joint mission, Kofi Annan, joint special envoy, and then later on Lakhdar Brahimi, and it kept following very closely. At some point, maybe there was over-enthusiasm, and certain steps were taken, including of the representative of the government, of the regime, and out of particular preference here, political preference, but only to maintain the necessary dialogue and channel of contact. Maybe this started a situation leading to the Arab League being considered as a clearly a party to the conflict. Recently, there were attempts to maybe inject some balance in the position, including statements taken or made by the Secretary General of Arab League welcoming Russian-American efforts, including welcoming most recent framework agreement between the two on the chemical weapons. Obviously, everybody is happy. Not all members of the League are happy with statements, but I personally think that this is the right approach.
Thank you. Karim, perhaps you would like to comment on Turkey?
Sure. I would argue that both within Syria and the broader Middle East, there's kind of three competing paradigms for power and influence in the region. You have resistance Islam, led by Iran. You have sectarian Sunni Islam, led by Saudi Arabia. And you have what I would describe as modern Islam, led by Turkey. And, these kind of battles are taking place throughout the region, but in particular, I think you see these strands in Syria. So, I know that Erdogan's Turkey is not a perfect place, but from the vantage point of the United States, I don't think we have a better friend or ally in Syria than Turkey. They've been accused of acquiescing or even abetting various jihadist forces. But I think the bottom line is that if we, in the next 4 or 5 years, had the equivalent of a Syrian Erdogan come to power, that would be the best case scenario. I mean, I was reading an interview with someone from Hamas a few days ago who was talking about how the rebels in Syria were just too radical and intolerant. This was, someone from Hamas talking about the Syrian rebels. So I think that, from my vantage point, a greater Turkish role in Syria, a greater Turkish influence in Syria is something that is positive. And we have to be realistic about what is achievable in Syria and who are the forces we have to work with.
Last words, Andrew. No word. All right. Well, we are right on time. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel for an excellent discussion.